That was awesome. Who knew? I need you to stand right here the whole night. All right, I just, before we get started, I had the pleasure right when everybody's walking in. I can't remember the young lady, but she's sitting right there. Could you hold your book up? So you probably can't see it because it's small writing, but that book that's the book we're all reading for this month, and it's written in Japanese. And as the story goes, as I was told at the beginning of the night, she bought that in Japan, and Martin Luther King was really looking forward to his book being published in Japanese. And I think that couldn't describe what Martin Luther King stood for more than anything else tonight. Thank you for sharing that. So last night, at the end, we're going to do some reflections at the end, and what are some of the biggest things that you took away from this book and the experience over the last month. And then we'll also open it up if you have any other comments or questions. That's how we'll close out the night tonight. So I wanted to start today with a theme that runs throughout every chapter of this, of Martin Luther King's book. And if you have the same book I have, clearly not the book written in Japanese because it looks about half the size of this. It's on page 167 where Martin Luther King writes, "Corrective legislation requires organization to bring it to life. Laws only declare rights. They do not deliver them. The oppressed," and I would say that probably more than just the oppressed, but the oppressed must take hold of laws and transform them into effective mandates. Hence, the absence of powerful organization has limited the degree of application and extent of practical success. So not to rehash things that we've already talked about, but just some examples of how we've created laws in our country, but we're missing some steps, and we're missing the unenforceable obligations, right? The things that we can't enforce, which is why they haven't been more successful or weren't more successful at the time, among probably a few other reasons. But like, for example, in 1808, believe it or not, long before the Civil War and the end of slavery, we outlawed the importing of Africans for the purpose of slavery. Yet over the next couple decades after that, we imported 60,000 more Africans. So if the law said we can't do that anymore, how did we keep doing it? Because it was probably 10, 15 years before we started putting ships in the Atlantic Ocean to actually stop it. So we wrote it on paper, but we didn't have the will or the unenforceable obligations to actually carry it out. As you know, the 13th Amendment outlawed slavery, and then we instituted a new version of slavery with black codes and convict leasing. The 15th Amendment said everybody can vote. That was in 1870. And we've talked a lot about 1965 Voting Rights Act. Why did we need that if in 1870 we said everybody should be able to vote? Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, and years later, and we'll hear about some more tonight, how schools weren't integrated. In the 60s, schools weren't integrated, even though the U.S. Supreme Court, the highest court in all the land, said we must integrate schools, yet we had governors standing in front of doors of schools saying, no, not me, we're not doing this. And then more recently, if you look at something that I was all too familiar with in policing, and these things were all billed with this will help end police violence, officer-involved shootings, those sort of things, body cameras, police commissions, things like that. We've implemented all of them, and yet these things still, now we watch officer-involved shootings on body cameras. Because one, it's not that they weren't necessary, but there's some steps that we missed or that we didn't do. We didn't work, in some cases, we didn't work at all on the unenforceable obligations. And to me, those are probably more important than the written law. The written law will follow if we have the unenforceable obligations. So I wanted to go over a case that I love this, the Greensboro 4, because these kids, these 4 kids, were not born into some important positions, important families. They were freshmen at North Carolina A&T in Greensboro, North Carolina. Just regular, everyday people, right? Regular, everyday students. The youngest was 17. You'll hear from him in a video that we'll play. But they, just regular, everyday people decided we need to do something. And they changed the world. They changed policy. They changed practice. Their actions ended up giving people rights that they didn't have before that. So wanted to go over it real quick. So on February 1st, the 4, I'll say their names: David Richmond, Franklin McCain, Ezell Blair, and Joe McNeil. And you'll hear from Joe McNeil. 4 freshmen at North Carolina A&T. And if you go to North Carolina A&T now, they have a dorm building named after each one of them. So they decided they didn't want to not be able to sit at the lunch counter in Woolworths, because in Woolworths, the black customers, they could shop in the store and do all that, but they couldn't eat at the lunch counter. They had to go around back. So they decided they would go in there and do sit-ins. So interesting enough, when they sat down, they were asked to leave, and they said no. They ordered coffee, and they wouldn't get served. So a young African-American girl that was working at Woolworths approached them and called them stupid, ignorant, rabble-rouser, and troublemakers. Another African-American person in the store said to them, "You're hurting race relations by sitting there." Now, why do you think African-Americans told the African-American students that? Why do you think you would think, oh, they would support it? Why did they tell them they were stupid or rabble-rousers and they shouldn't be doing that? Right. And then an older, and as she was described, an elderly white woman walks up to the 4 students and says, quote, "I am just so proud of you. My only regret is that you didn't do this 10 or 15 years ago," unquote. The store manager didn't call the police because he said these young kids, because they were kids, right? They're 17, 18 years old. They'll peter out. They ain't gonna stay at the lunch counter. So he didn't call the police because he figured, they'll get bored sitting there and they'll leave. They didn't get bored. The sit-ins grew to other places and grew in that store. As the sit-ins grew, students began boycotting other stores and other lunch counters. The sales at the boycotted stores dropped by 1/3, leading the owner to abandon the segregation policies. And on Monday, July 25th, 1960, after nearly $200,000 in losses, which would be about $1.67 million in today's dollars, and a reduction of the manager's salary because he wasn't meeting his sales goals, Clarence Harris, the manager, asked 4 of his black employees, Geneva Tisdale, Susie Morrison, Anitha Jones, and Charles Bass, to change out of their work clothes and order a meal at the counter, and they were the first to ever order a meal at the Woolworths lunch counter there. If you're ever in Greensboro, North Carolina, I was fortunate that my daughters had a track meet at North Carolina A&T when they were like 10 years old. And the Woolworths where this occurred at is now a museum. And you can actually sit at the actual counter that these young freshmen sat at, and they've made it into a museum where you can tour around. It's very nice. And so I love that story because it's just 4 regular, everyday kids, right? That one day said, enough is enough. We're going to do something about it. And it grew into this big, massive movement. And in chapter 5, Martin Luther King talks about the 3 levers: the ideological, the economic, and the political. And this is the economic lever, right? It's forcing people to change because you're taking what you provide, your dollars, your economy to this store away until you give me the rights that you give everybody else. So this video is about 6 minutes long. One of the reasons I love this video is because it's one thing to read in a book, and it's another thing to actually hear from the people involved. And Joe McNeil is on this video and talking about what he felt, why he did what he did. So I think it's pretty special. So.
Greensboro 4 were yours truly, Joe McNeil, David Richmond, Junior Blair, and Frank McCain. We all lived in the same dormitory. I think we're all very young. I was the youngest, I was 17. I reacted to the Jim Crow South with anger. I did not believe for 1 minute that I was a second-class citizen, that I was inferior in any way to whites, greens, whatever. I couldn't live the lie. We decided to take a stand. Let's go. Let's do it. So we purchased small items, sundry items, to establish the fact that we were customers. And then we sat down on a stool and asked for a cup of coffee. And the store manager told us that he wasn't going to serve us. The local establishment grossly underestimated our anger and ability to hang in there. So when we were leaving the store, the Associated Press was there. And they said, "Hey, boys, what you gonna do?" We said, "Well, we're gonna come back, and we're gonna keep coming back until you decide to serve us." We started growing. First day 4, the second day, probably 16 or 20. It was organic. It was a mind of its own, it kept growing. We decided that whatever actions we were going to take, they were going to be nonviolent. We remained nonviolent. On the third day, it started to get rough. At any time, we could have been carried out of that store in a pine box. We didn't want to be martyrs, but we had to do what we needed to do.
I was a student at Fisk University in Nashville. February 1st, 1960, we heard that 4 young black men sat in at a lunch counter in Greensboro. We had our first sit-in in Nashville on February 13th. I'm really amused sometimes because people say, "Oh, you were so brave." And the truth is, I was afraid the whole time. But the choice was to do what was necessary to end segregation or to tolerate segregation. And that just was not acceptable.
Greensboro became the message. It was like, if they can do it in Greensboro, we too can do it. And there were young people and people not so young, adults, in major cities outside of the South, participating, sitting in at lunch counters. They were picketing the stores to support the students in the South. And you had people like Martin Luther King Jr. saying things like, by sitting down, we were standing up for the very best in American tradition.
And I think that's really important for people to know that it was ordinary people, quote unquote ordinary, like themselves, who did everything for the civil rights movement, that it was really a people's movement.
These young people injected something very meaningful, something really beautiful. I said, you may not have a lot of money, you may not have a lot of power, but you have what Dr. King and Gandhi and others call soul power. Just using your body as a nonviolent instrument, as a tool, you can change things. You can inspire hundreds and thousands and millions of people to speak up, to speak out.
I walked away with an attitude that if our country is screwed up, don't give up. Unscrew it. Don't give up. Which in retrospect is pretty good for a bunch of teenagers.
If our country is screwed up, so I don't know, I think probably every single person in here was more mature than I was when I was 17, but I can pretty much tell you I wouldn't have been sitting at that counter when I was 17. I had other things I was doing that weren't as useful as sitting at that counter. I mean, we forget these were kids. They're like my daughter's age. And I think if my daughter called me up in those times and said she was doing that, I'm like, no, you aren't. Come home. I'm not putting you. So again, it's just regular people. The other thing that always strikes me that I think gets lost a lot of times when we talk about whether it's civil rights or some other movement that changed our country for the better is, and you can see it in this video, every one of those videos, and if you Google the Greensboro sit-ins and you look at the pictures from that time, most of those pictures show it too. Those protests were diverse. They weren't just black protesters. And if you look at some of the pictures where people are being assaulted with milk and other food, a lot of those are white students or white adults sitting at the counter taking the heat, standing up for the ability for all people to sit at the lunch counters. And I think sometimes we don't talk enough about that. So I wanted to read the next page I have for you. Let's see, where's it at? It will be page, let's see, 147, if you have my book. And Martin Luther King writes, he's talking about at the time in the 60s, the African-American community didn't have a lot of access to TV and radio. You know, they weren't running those news information. So how could they get information out and that sort of thing? So he writes, Negroes have had to write their most pervasive essays with the blunt pen of marching ranks. The many white political leaders and well-meaning friends who ask Negro leadership to leave the streets may not realize that they are asking us effectively to silence ourselves. The twice forgotten man in America has always been the Negro. His groans were not heard, his needs were unfelt, until he found the means to state his case in the public square. More white people learned more about the shame of America and finally faced some aspects of it during the years of nonviolent protest than during the century before. Nonviolent direct action will continue to be a significant source of power until it is made irrelevant. So he also, throughout the book, talks about people that are supposed to be supporters, but when the going gets tough, go, hey, now's not the time. You know, the Birmingham letter was about 8 pastors that were against Martin Luther King coming, saying now's not the time, just wait. And that's where his famous quote is, wait almost always means never. So the example of that I want to give you is the Freedom Riders. And some of the people that we credit the most in the civil rights movement and understanding and helping, which they did, were some of the same people that said, hold on, wait. And you'll see that in a second. So in 1961, and this is also an example of how we write things down on a piece of paper, or we make a decision in the courts, but yet we're missing elements, so it's not fulfilled out in the community for actual people. So in 1961, the Freedom Riders sought to test a 1960 decision, which was the Boynton versus Virginia decision that said the previous Supreme Court decision that said you must integrate the buses, which, by the way, was in 1946. The Boynton decision said that includes the terminals too, not just the buses, meaning you can't have separate bathrooms, you can't have separate water fountains, you can't have those sort of things. So the Freedom Riders were knowing that this actually wasn't the practice, that things were still segregated. By the way, you know that U.S. Supreme Court decision that said you must integrate buses, as I just said, was in 1946. Does anybody remember what year Rosa Parks got arrested? 55, after 1946, right? Because we still didn't actually do what the Supreme Court said to do. So 1960, the decision is rendered in the courts that said the terminals must be integrated just the same as the buses. So the Freedom Riders said, we're gonna show that that's not the case, and so they do the Freedom Rides. The Freedom Riders tried to use the white-only restrooms, the lunch counters throughout Alabama, South Carolina, and the southern states. The original 13 Freedom Riders were 7 African-American riders and 6 white riders. They left Washington, D.C. on a Greyhound bus on May 4th, 1961. Their plan was to reach New Orleans on May 17th to commemorate the 7th anniversary of the Supreme Court's Brown versus the Board of Education decision. The first violent incident occurred on May 12th in Rock Hill, South Carolina. John Lewis, who you saw in there, an African-American with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and a white Freedom Rider, World War II veteran, Albert Bigelow, and another black rider were viciously attacked as they attempted to enter the white-only waiting area. The next one was Anniston, Alabama, on May 14th. Greyhound bus was the first to arrive in Anniston. There was an angry mob of about 200 people surrounded the bus, causing the driver to continue past the station. The mob followed the bus in cars, and when the tires on the bus blew out, someone threw a bomb into the bus. The Freedom Riders escaped the bus as it burst into flames, only to be brutally beaten by members of the surrounding mob. So we have a court decision that says buses must be integrated, and yet we have mobs attacking the people that do that. Birmingham, Alabama, the second bus traveled to Birmingham, and those riders were also beaten by an angry mob, many of who brandished metal pipes. The Public Safety Commissioner, Bull Connor, stated that even though he knew there was going to be problems, it was Mother's Day, so he didn't have any police officers there. Very, very courageous gentleman. Photographs of the Greyhound bus and the bloodied riders appeared on the front pages of the newspapers throughout the country, and it revealed what Martin Luther King said in that verse I read, that the whole country could see firsthand what was actually happening. The Attorney General Robert Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's brother, began negotiating with the governor of Alabama and the bus companies to secure bus drivers and to ensure that the buses could get somewhere safely. So they coordinated this. The police were, accompanying the buses until the police abandoned the Greyhound bus just before it arrived in Montgomery, Alabama. Think they might have known what was coming? When the white mob attacked the riders with baseball bats, clubs, as they disembarked, eventually the federal government sent marshals. And this is what the Kennedys said, both John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy. President Kennedy said, quote, "I would also hope that any persons, whether a citizen of Alabama or visitors there, would refrain from any action which in any way tend to provoke further outbreaks." Not condemning the outbreaks, but condemning the actions that led to the outbreaks, the riders. U.S. Attorney General Kennedy, Robert Kennedy stated or urged a cooling off period, and this is his official quote. A very difficult condition exists now in the states of Mississippi and Alabama. Besides the groups of freedom riders traveling through these states, there are curiosity seekers, publicity seekers, and others who are seeking to serve their own causes, as well as many persons who are traveling because they must use the interstate carriers to reach their destination. In this confused situation, there is increasingly the possibility that innocent persons may be injured, and a mob asks no questions. A cooling off period is needed. It would be wise for those traveling through these two sites to delay their trips until the present state of confusion and danger has passed and an atmosphere of reason and normalcy has been restored. So just imagine if you're this person that's had to sit in separate rooms. In my larger presentation, there's a soldier coming back in full uniform, standing in a segregated waiting room. And I'm just thinking, what's that guy thinking? Right? In full, I could have lost my life fighting in this battle, in these wars. And then I come back and I have to and I'm lesser than, I have to stand in a separate room. These bus riders who are getting beaten and thrown bombs in the bus, and the president and the attorney general says, now's not the time. Calm down, you just wait. And not telling the mob, hey, you just wait, go away. So this is a short video of the Freedom Riders, just to give you an idea, and it has some of the pictures that were taken and shown across the country that woke people up to what actually was going on. Because in those days, we didn't have social media. So if you weren't there, you didn't really get to see it.
On December 5th, 1960, the U.S. Supreme Court issued a ruling in the case of Boynton versus Virginia. The case overturned a lower court conviction of a black law student, Bruce Boynton, for trespassing in the whites-only section of a bus terminal restaurant. The Supreme Court ruled that racial segregation in public transportation was illegal because such segregation violated the Interstate Commerce Act. However, the U.S. government did not actively enforce the ruling, and many bus terminals continued to segregate the races. To challenge this, the interracial civil rights organization known as CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, decided to draw attention to the continuing problem. In May 1961, CORE began one of the most important protests of the civil rights era, the Freedom Rides of 1961. During the Freedom Rides, several hundred civil rights workers, black and white, rode Greyhound and Trailways buses through the Deep South to challenge local segregation laws and customs. Freedom Riders faced hostility, discrimination, and quite frequently, mob violence. But they persevered, maintaining their dedication to nonviolent direct action. Some of the notable Freedom Riders included civil rights activist and now Congressman John Lewis and James Farmer, National Director of CORE. Lewis was one of the 13 original riders and was brutally beaten on more than one occasion. On May 21, 1961, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was in Montgomery, Alabama, to support the Freedom Riders. While speaking at the First Baptist Church, several thousand whites surrounded the building. The hostile whites rioted, threatening blacks inside and setting fire to automobiles outside. From the church basement, Dr. King called Attorney General Robert Kennedy, requesting help. U.S. Marshals soon arrived, but the growing mob pelted them with bricks and bottles. Alabama's governor declared martial law in Montgomery and ordered National Guard troops to restore order. By midnight, the streets were finally calm, and the people in the church, who had feared for their lives, were permitted to leave. 3 days later, the troops escorted the Freedom Riders as they left town. In September 1961, at the insistence of the Attorney General, the Interstate Commerce Commission ordered an end to segregation on interstate transportation and within transportation facilities. By late 1961, the riots ended, but the courage and persistence of the Freedom Riders forever changed American history.
So in the video, the young lady said, people thought I was so courageous, but the truth is I was in fear the whole time. So she was probably, one of the things she feared was probably being beaten at that time. So a lot of times when we're trying to change our country for the better, we might not fear being beaten, but we might fear being, I don't know what we call it now, canceled or ostracized. And so it still takes courage to do all these things that we need to do to be able to make some of these changes. So before we get to the group discussion, I wanted to read 2 more passages from the book that will set us up for the group discussion. And that is on page, if I can find it, 186, if you have my book. So he's talking about Arnold Toynbee. He says, Arnold Toynbee has said that some 26 civilizations have risen upon the face of the earth. Almost all of them has descended into junk heaps of destruction. The decline and fall of these civilizations, according to Toynbee, was not caused by external invasions, but by internal decay. They failed to respond creatively to the challenges impinging upon them. If Western civilization does not now respond constructively to the challenge to banish racism, from some future historian will have to say that a great civilization died because it lacked the soul and commitment to make justice a reality for all men. So if you think about it, like, are we going to get invaded by another country and be destroyed, or are we going to destroy ourselves, right? It's probably just as poignant now as when Martin Luther King wrote it. So last thing I wanted to read is on page, I think, 177, yes. We have inherited a large house, a great world house, in which we have to live together, black and white, Easterner and Westerner, Gentile and Jew, Catholic and Protestant, Muslim and Hindu, a family unduly separated in ideas, culture, and interest, who, because we can never live apart again, must learn somehow to live with each other in peace. So I think that's our challenge. One of the things I really respect about Martin Luther King, he never talked about dividing, leaving. He said, we're living here. How do we make here better? And unfortunately, I would hope I wouldn't have to say this, but I find myself saying it a lot. I think we have a great country, but we have issues, and we could be better. And too often, I think some people believe if we criticize something about our country that could be better, then we don't love our country, or that we're not patriotic. And we can see examples of what happens to people that are considered not patriotic. So if you take the next few moments, and then the last part on here we'll do collectively. But if at your table you would discuss one of the things that Martin Luther King said in that last passage I read, is how do we live with each other in peace? So not super specific meaning, but like what can we do to help ourselves live with each other in peace when so often right now we have people attacking each other for everything. I used to joke that if you and I disagree with each other, the first step for some people is to start personally attacking me. We're not talking about the issue anymore. Now you're, unintelligent, or you're this, or you're that. And nobody's talking anymore once we start doing that. So what can we do as a church, as individuals, collectively, to live with each other with different cultures, different opinions, as Martin Luther King says, in peace. So take about 5-10 minutes to discuss that, and then we'll report out and open it up for your biggest takeaways on the book. So go ahead for the next 5-10 minutes. Okay, who would like to share what some of the stuff you talked about on how do we live with each other in peace? Any volunteers? Ooh, volunteering somebody to volunteer. I like it. Over here at the front table.
Thank you. So in relation to the first quote, we talked about how a lot of the internal decay is in relation to the sin that we see in the world, knowing that we are the body of Christ, and that God has called us to love one another. And a lot of the reasons that when we see something, we don't say something is because of a protectionist mindset that we have to protect our own personal resources, our own spending. I know earlier we talked about the economic effects of the freedom riders, as well as like issues with transportation in their modes, as well as like the economic boycotts by the protesters sitting down. It stopped the economy, and therefore it caught attention. And so us as the church, we have to really look at what we're lifting up. And so we shared about that and really being separate from the world.
Yeah. And I think that is one place that an organization like this church that has thousands of people that come here is the people that are doing what we want done, that are helping make us a better community, is supporting those organizations, is great. Yeah. All right, who else? Couple more before we jump into open discussion. Ooh, more pointing. That's a perfect one. Yeah, I agree. Here comes the mic right there.
We could have been a part of the group over there, because we were just talking about leading with love, that as Christians, we are called to love. And God so loved the world, and in the United States, we really have a fear of other people, and that fear is, based in the world's perception or what the world is talking about. We talked about DEI a little bit, and I encourage people, stop saying DEI. It's diversity. Like if you look around, there's a diverse group of people, but God so loved the world, and he made me in his image. He made you in his image. And so God loves us before we first loved him, so of thinking about that. And so living in peace requires us to think differently. This gentleman Richard gave a book reference that's from a Native American pastor, and I'll let Richard tell us that book.
The pastor's name is Mark Charles, and the book is Unsettling Truths. He was a co-author. And on page 116, it says, the sovereign creator is God, who originally intended unity and community for humanity. So the elevation of one group over another as the standard and the authority for judging all others undermines the image of God. God created us for community with others. The isolated person is an abstraction. And the last thing he says, I am not apart from thou.
Yeah.
We're not separated.
Kind of reminds me of why Martin Luther King was against the whole Black Power movement in the term, because he said anybody with ultimate power over another person, even if that's Black people over other people, will abuse other people. Yeah. Anybody else? Any other table? Yes, in the back.
We just talked about the importance of relationship with people that are different than ourselves, that we would naturally not necessarily want to maintain a relationship. And when they're asking us or confronting us or challenging us with hard things that aren't godly or are not right, asking why do you believe that, and really pushing them to answer the question rather than just kind of spout the anger. And when looking at the freedom rides, that was kind of, they were putting themselves in a place to be seen. And they weren't fighting, but it was really uncomfortable for everyone around them. And that's what forced the conversation. So basically putting ourselves in the uncomfortable places and forcing the conversation, forcing the change.
Good, good. Anybody else? Yes, back table on the left, right there.
I think I was struck by on page 164 where he says, we must turn more of our energies and focus our creativity on the useful things that translate into power. And this is not a program for a distant tomorrow when our children will somehow have acquired enough education to do it for themselves. We in this generation must do the work, and in doing it, stimulate our children to learn and acquire higher levels of skill and technique. And we talked about how, like, personally, how it's like, gosh, it's so hard to forgive somebody who is wronging us and who has never owned up to it. And yet how that is what God calls us to do, and how we have to demonstrate it for our children. And this is, on a personal level, whether it's on our street, in our city, in our country, in another country across the world, these things are happening, and we may be called to it in different ways.
Yeah, very good, very good. Anybody else? All right, so let's jump into just over the last month as you've read this book. What were some of your biggest takeaways, either from the book or discussions you've had at tables over the last month, from Martin Luther King's last book? What would you say are your biggest takeaways or things that you'll remember the most about this experience? She's pointing a lot. She's going to wear her arm out pointing at you.
So I would say the most significant takeaway that I got from reading this was how relevant it still is today. This book could be written today.
Feels like it, huh?
Yeah.
Like he just wrote this yesterday. Wait a minute, that's 1967.
Yeah.
Yeah.
57 years.
Good point. Agree 100%. What else? Over here in the front.
I'm just going to piggyback on that to say, it's so easy to look back at like an MLK Jr. and like we were talking about people that we know who like would say like if they lived then they would have done this and they would have done that and how they would have been resistors. But the truth is like if we would have done that then we're going to do it right now. And 2025 is like it's right now. So, if I'm going to claim that I would have been on the right side of history in 1965, I need to be on the right side 2025. And we got some work to do as a church, but also like as a community, right? So I'm just saying.
And if you read the whole book, Martin Luther King even says back then most people were not directly involved. It was a very small percentage that actually did the work. Even though people supported it, they weren't putting themselves out there then either. So we can all say that. That probably makes us feel good. But
hopefully we're inspired that we want to be part of the resistance because it's time for us to step up as people that really love Jesus and love other people.
Yeah.
So let's go.
And I would just add, as we spoke about before, Martin Luther King talks mainly about the African-American community, although he does expand it to many other groups, anybody in poverty and all that. But I would say the same thing applies to any group, area, whatever that we think is being treated unfairly, doesn't have equal access and all those things. It's not, exclusive to African-American community. I think the philosophy works with everybody. What else? Yes, middle table here and then the back table. I think there's two people here.
And just building on what was just said, I highlighted so much of this book. It's so amazing and truly astounding how it could have been written today. And on 136, I feel like this just kind of sums up where we are now and perhaps how we all need to be acting. If history teaches anything, it is that evil is recalcitrant and determined and never voluntarily relinquishes its hold, short of an almost fanatical resistance. Evil must be attacked by a counteracting persistence, by the day-to-day assault of the battering rams of justice.
Yes, I would agree with that 120%.
The sad part for me was it was an eye-opener from the laws that were made in those days that were never followed. Kind of right around those lines again now, you know. I mean, coming from the highest part of the office of presidents that are not following, what was written already that was supposed to be law, that they're not following. They're disregarding it. They're making their own laws to fit their own agendas. So that was similar to what was going on in those days, which was very, very sad to see, and very hard for me to really see that, what you brought to light. A lot of those laws that were made for voting rights and a lot of the other things that were there that never got put in place,
Yeah.
It was like they were checking off a box and we're going to do this, but we didn't do this.
Because of this pressure, but I'm really not into it. Like my heart isn't into it, or we didn't address the root causes of why we had the issue in the first place. So it's just ink. But I'll tell you, to your point, when I watched, especially the national news right now on things going on in the federal government, sometimes I just want to box up a bunch of these books and send it to people and go, your response, maybe you should read this on your response to what you don't agree with. And instead of just howling at the moon, maybe you should take a hint from how Martin Luther King addressed stuff he didn't agree with. Yeah, yeah. And many other people. It wasn't just Martin Luther King. It was all sorts of people. Yeah. What else? Yes, back left table.
Thank you. Yeah, so when he wrote this book, obviously it was his last one, so he was able to have some perspective on things that went right and things that went wrong with a lot of the movements he was leading. And I feel like a lot of the talks about the pitfalls, like with Stokely Carmichael, et cetera, that he wrote about are the same pitfalls that we're running into now. So for me, I was like, wow, they were dealing with this way back then. These are the same errors that, we don't have to commit if we just dedicate ourselves to both practicing and living these principles, but also studying up on our history.
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of things that go into people's motives on how they do stuff. That's more than just I care for my neighbor, I care for my brother and my sister. Yes, yeah. What else? Or any comments, questions, anything? Open it up for anything before, and because I have some music to end the night on. So, yes.
I was gonna share a personal story. So I think we started out this in January, and so for me personally, it was a very hard time because in my day work, I care for African Americans who have a very rare disease, sickle cell disease, and so I'm very committed to building a strong program in Sacramento. But right around January, I was accused by one of my patients who's very vocal in her community, in the African American community, and she accused me wrongly, and said so many hurtful things to me. And so I walked away from that situation. I told myself, okay, I'm gonna love her, I'm gonna try to forgive her. But I was so discouraged. I was at the point of just saying, I want to call it quits. I'm not accepted in this community. Let this go to somebody else. But we started the book study, and it talked more about if you're the one who's been falsely accused, or if you're the one who's been wronged, you have to forgive. And so I really took that upon myself. I'm not just gonna resign. I'm gonna forgive, and I'm gonna keep going. I really want to build this still into the best program I can for as long as I'm here before I go. And so I want to say, at least it's been very encouraging to be a part of this group.
Oh, I'm very glad to hear that. Sorry you had to go through that. Anyone else? Yes.
I didn't read the book. I'm here with my husband. But one thing that I have become very aware of through our plight in humanity is the fact that we can change laws, but if a man's heart is not changed, it does nothing. And I think this has been the fight from the beginning of time, and it will be until we graduate and go to heaven. It's man's heart has to be changed.
Yeah. Behind you, James.
I think along those same lines, one of the big takeaways for me was that true integration of all people comes from, like, we can't always control the laws or impact the laws as we're seeing now in some capacity, but what we can do is have an obedience to the unenforceable laws, and morally and as Christians we know what those are. So if we could start at home and carry that out into our communities and our jobs, maybe it could have a ripple effect.
Because, you know, if you put your heart into it, you can accomplish almost anything, right? I preach to my daughters all the time. Your heart is big. In sports, if you play with your heart, you'll overcome all that, right? Yeah, yeah. Anybody else? We good? All right, so I don't know if you've seen this performance before, but this is the actual lyrics or the song was many decades before the song became popular, but We Shall Overcome became kind of a theme song, I guess you would say, for the civil rights movement. And this is, I don't remember where it's at, but this is Diana Ross singing We Shall Overcome. And then we'll close out with James afterwards. Okay.
Love you. Thank you. Deep in my heart, I do believe someday we'll all be free. Someday we'll all be free. I may not know how long 'twill be. Someday we'll all be free. Someday we'll all be free. Someday we'll all be free. Hold on, my brother, give me your hand. Someday we'll all be free. Someday we'll all be free. Learning to love, we'll find our way. Someday someday we'll all be free. Someday we'll all be free. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. Thank you very much.
I just want to say, one, I do believe that tomorrow will be a better day because people like you that actually care for other folks. And that's how we will make tomorrow better. We shall overcome. We shall accomplish all these things. And I also want to just say thank you for all your time. I know we're all very busy people. It has been a blessing to me to be able to be here with you for the last month. And I'm so appreciative that to be a part of a church like this and to spend time with people like you that actually care, are always learning and wanting to make tomorrow better for all people. So thank you very much for all that you do. And with that, I'll turn it over to James.